Welcome back, and we are offending people again with salvation by faith and its truth. Let's get into it. Hello, if you're new here, I am Joshua Pearsall, and this is Practical Christian Lessons. We are continuing reading through Jeffrey Rickman's new series of articles, and I believe he's still working on several of them, called The Offense of Methodism. Today is Sola Fide, faith alone, in this case, salvation by faith alone, is the exact topic at hand. And this is something that has caused a lot of offense, even still to this day. It does directly go against the official statements from Roman Catholicism, as per the Council of Trent, which anathematized faith alone, despite how present it is in, say, the Church Fathers. They constantly, especially the Greek Fathers, use the phrase faith alone throughout a ton of their writings. And it was an accepted position within Roman Catholicism pre-Trent. And I'll probably link some videos or articles detailing that. We're not going to get into that. We're reading from this today. We do a lot of stuff here: theology, history, apologetics, as I was just doing a little bit of just now. And we also organize a lot of those into playlists on our channel. So if you don't see anything interesting to you in the description below, or links or things that I put in a pinned comment, whatever, check the playlist on our channel. I will almost certainly have a resource if it's related to what this video is about. But with that, this is from Jeffrey Rickman. He's a Methodist pastor in the Global Methodist Church in Nowata, Oklahoma. You can find his podcast as Plain Spoken Podcast. He is on YouTube doing a daily live stream talking about issues of our time, especially centering around Methodism, and also streams his sermons on a different channel called Nowata, Nowata Methodist. So feel free to check that as well if you're interested in his preaching. I believe it will be linked in this article of his that you can find below. And of course, go find this on Substack, like it, share it, engage with it there, and from there you'll also find links directly to all his things as well. So we are going to go ahead and get on into this. The Offense, John Wesley's sermon, Salvation by Faith. This is the second of a series on how and why Methodist revival was so offensive to its original context. I believe most features of original Methodism continue to be offensive, which is why they have been slowly and intentionally forgotten. Original documents from the earliest days of Methodism reveal a counter-cultural organization doing spiritual warfare against worldliness in the church. Each document we cover in this series will detail the specifics involved in this warfare, with an invitation for us to reintegrate these things, not only into our collective memory, but into our collective beliefs today. Consider reading my introduction to the series to learn more about my motivations and hopes for you as you consider my words. Or go watch our previous video where we read through the first one of these. Salvation by Faith is the first sermon in John Wesley's published compendium, Sermons on Several Occasions. I have been reading Albert Outler's The Works of John Wesley, which contain his first 33 sermons. Wesley published these sermons, and they were widely read and consulted for the explicit purpose of establishing and explaining Methodist doctrine. It was his earnest expectation that all Methodist preachers consult his sermons in order to understand fundamental doctrines that they were expected to likewise teach. To this day, many Methodist denominations maintain these sermons are doctrinal standards. They were influential in the early days of Methodism, and they should continue to be today. Unfortunately, this is more easily said than done. Building familiarity with these texts requires that people actually spend time with them. It is my earnest hope that you will spend time reflecting on this text with me today, especially as it is true to the form established in the series. It is offensive for many reasons spelled out below. In order to track with my quotations, you might consider reading the sermon, which I'll have a link to in his article, on your own, or if my voice and appearance don't annoy you, you might actually watch me deliver the sermon. And he's got his video linked here. The Offense. It is my understanding that this sermon played a role in the public and ongoing tug of war for the hearts of the English. Trained at Oxford and given relatively high status, Wesley could have easily become an esteemed institutionalist. And while he was a proud clergyman in the Church of England until death, he was also radical in his disposition toward the faith. He embraced the evangelical zeal of many dissenter groups while insisting that these sensibilities could and should be imported into Anglicanism via the Methodist revival. He structured this revival so as to function as a sort of parachurch ministry alongside the Church of England. This sermon was delivered at St. Mary's in Oxford before the university thinkers and theologians in June of 1738. It was also obviously published in writing, and I would think it's safe to assume that it was delivered in some form or another in various settings over the years. Anyway, the first offense here is that it upset the sensibilities of the crypto-Catholics within the Anglican Church. And if you want a bit more of the history behind that, go watch our live stream from, it was either the end of March or start of April, and it was on my pilgrimage through England. I talk about a bit of the history behind some of these things. If you're not interested, don't worry about it. Roman Catholicism and Crypto-Catholicism. The English Isles went through a prolonged tug of war between Roman Catholic and Protestant thinkers and factions. The Crown facilitated a few transitions back and forth while the public engaged in various debates that quickly grew partisan and quite nasty. Though it is strange of this particular time in the West, Wesley's context was decidedly more anxious around the reality of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism here. While Pope Francis is an irritant to many in our culture, very few articulate a significant concern about him or the Roman Catholic magisterium exercising undue influence over American politics or public life. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency, it was over the cries of many Protestant voices concerned about his loyalty to the Vatican. Anxieties in the modern West around Catholicism, though some expressed, see Amy Coney Barrett's examinations for Supreme Court Justice. They climb nowhere near the heights of previous eras in the last few centuries. And this was a big historical thing, Rome being its own nation for a lot of people. When Rome was no longer the state church for so many, they did seriously question the loyalty of the people, because their ultimate loyalty is supposed to be, of course, to Christ, but then also to Rome under the Roman pontiff. So they're like, how can we trust you if, say, the Vatican engages in some political affair with us and they end up on the other side? And that was a real question that they had to, a lot of people then had to deal with. A lot of interesting stuff there. We don't have time to get into that today. In Wesley's day, Roman Catholicism had actually been driven out of England a couple of times, and a lot of blood had been shed in doing so. Martin Luther, the guy who kicked off the Protestant Reformation, was regarded as an instrument of God, reclaiming the church from the Roman Catholic delusion. Even so, many within the Anglican Church have always been drawn to facets of the Roman Catholic Church. The Church of England was intentionally built as a via media, understood as mixing the best of Roman Catholic and Protestant theology together in a sustainable and gracious amalgam. Within the fold, many priests have been allowed to lean very heavily to one side or another in that dialectic. Despite his harsh rhetoric here and other places against popery, John Wesley himself was more sympathetic to Roman Catholic doctrine than most Methodists today, and I'm right there with him. Not all of them. If you watch this channel, you know I have very strong critiques as well on a lot of their errors, just as Wesley himself did. He confessed the perpetual virginity of Mary, for instance, and he was never willing to state flatly that all Roman Catholics go to hell, though in today's piece he does call them sons of perdition. I was reminded by a lady on Facebook today that Wesley's words were written prior to Vatican II. Her opinion was that the historic events changed historic doctrine so as to ameliorate this tension. I am not convinced this is the right understanding of Vatican II. To give my own piece there, Vatican II has absolutely changed and even reversed a lot of the doctrines from previous Roman Catholicism. However, I don't think it's in such a way that John Wesley would approve of. In fact, I think in a lot of ways he would have said, those things are good, and now you've made all these other things so much worse. This specific issue in question is that of works. Roman Catholic doctrine, while it acknowledges the vital role of faith, also makes the case for works playing a role in our salvation. In particular, the sacraments are seen as being particularly efficacious. Again, in other places, John Wesley was sympathetic to this, believing, for example, that communion could facilitate a spiritual change in the life of a partaker, which he's correct to do so. Even so, in this sermon, Wesley resolutely rebukes any initiating role of works in affecting our salvation at any stage of grace. For all our works, all our righteousness, which were before our believing, merited nothing but of God but condemnation. So far were they from deserving faith, which therefore, whenever given, is not of works. Neither is salvation of the works we do when we believe, for it is then God that worketh in us, and therefore that he giveth us a reward for what he himself worketh. Only commendeth the riches of his mercy, but leaveth us nothing whereof of glory. And if you are interested in Wesley's thoughts, he had a very strong stance on original sin. He wrote exactly one treatise, a few hundred pages, and it was on original sin. Admittedly, he doesn't address the sacraments at all. Yet he does address works broadly, both in the section just quoted and at the very beginning of the address. And while in later writings he makes clear that any number of ordinances can help us to participate in our own salvation, he makes it abundantly clear in this sermon that the doctrine of total depravity is key to authentic Christianity, and that the only thing we can contribute to our own salvation is the sin that made it necessary. When Wesley talks about participating in our own salvation, he's often talking about sanctification there, much as like how Paul tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. The first group that should be offended by this sermon should be Roman Catholics, and the people who want to shift doctrinally towards classic Roman Catholic doctrine. They are chastened not just by the single-minded emphasis on faith, but also by explicit burns aimed at the Roman See. Nothing but this can effectually prevent the increase of the Romish delusion among us. It is an endless to attack, one by one, all the errors of that church. But salvation by faith strikes at the root, and all fall at once where it is established. It was this doctrine which our church justly calls the strong rock and foundation of the Christian religion that first drove popery out of these kingdoms, and it is this alone that can keep it out. Nothing but this can give a check to that immorality which hath overspread the land as a flood. They can talk as sublimely of the law as he that hath it written by God in his heart. To hear them speak on this head might incline one to think they were not far from the kingdom of God. But take them out of the law into the gospel. Begin with the righteousness of faith with Christ, the end of the law to every one that believeth. And those who but now appeared almost, if not altogether Christians, stand confessed the sons of perdition, as far from life and salvation. God be merciful unto them, as the depth of hell from the height of heaven. The current debate about sacramental theology within my own denomination, the Global Methodist, has to contend with these words alongside other words the man also said about baptismal regeneration, infant baptism, the duty of constant communion, and his mother's own purported conversion at the Lord's table. What is offered in this sermon is a very stark statement on the initiating role of faith in salvation, to the exclusion of anything else. If you're wondering what's that purported conversion, there was in Methodist circles often called the evangelical conversion, where they felt that they did have salvation in their heart with John Wesley's mother. That happened at a Eucharist after she took supper, as she was taking the supper, I believe. Yet, lest we go too far in the direction of imagining a sort of lawlessness or low sacramentalism, which is rampant in Western Christianity culture, not just Western churches, but any church in Western culture, whether that's Greek Orthodox or whatever. This is creeping everywhere, unfortunately. He does make sure to dismissively insist that works are a vital part of the good life. The first usual objection to this is that to preach salvation or justification by faith only is to preach against holiness and good works, to which a short answer might be given: it would be so if we spake, as some do, of a faith which was separate from these. But we speak of a faith which is not so, but productive of all good works and holiness. Thank God for that. Otherwise, we really would be going in the direction of heresy. Even so, we need to acknowledge that these words here, as well as in many other places, indicate a significant difference between Methodist and Roman Catholic doctrine. Any sort of ecumenical dialogue between our traditions has to acknowledge this rather than sweep it under the rug. And I beg that everyone please stop trying to diminish our differences. They are important and they matter. Of all the things I have said to offend from the pulpit, one of the topics that has given me the most blowback has been any time that I bring up distinctions between Methodist and Roman Catholic doctrine. That is a no-no for many people. I continue to insist upon it, as I think peace is achieved by understanding differences rather than brushing them over. If the saints are to be equipped for ministry, then we need to understand how our soteriology, doctrine of how salvation works, stands in relation to other Christian traditions. We have a different, though similar, answer to Roman Catholicism. Speaking openly about the difference doesn't have to be a partisan, but it should be clear. Crypto-Catholics are those who have leanings or sympathies towards Rome. They exist today as they have always existed. There are a few in Methodism, though it is usually scandalous enough to think about just going back to Anglicanism. Those with high sacramental theology, belief in baptismal regeneration, real presence, frequent communion might chafe at the sermon. Sacraments do not and cannot save, at least in the way that Wesley is talking about salvation in this sermon. As a high sacramentologist myself, I agree with him. Wesley was a high sacramentologist. He's the one preaching the sermon. Remember that. Perfecting our sacramental or liturgical theology is so much rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic if we neglect the fundamental issues of sin and having faith. He's saying there that it's pointless. If you're rearranging the chairs on the Titanic as it's sinking, you're not doing anything. Next is offending the libs. As it stands, modern mainline Methodism has actually focused too much on good works in the vein of social justice to the detriment of the saving faith referenced here. And now there are many Methodists trying to push in the opposite direction, and that's its own problem. They were trying to go from focusing too much on good works to now focusing too much in the other direction. That's for another time. Mainline Protestantism is synonymous with liberalism. Liberalism is fundamentally undergirded by a presupposition that the faith we inherited doesn't have to be treated as seriously as has traditionally been the case. The scriptures can be disobeyed to little consequence. Liberalism is optimistic about human nature and salvation. It is not unusual at all to find a liberal who believes that people can do good works without knowing Jesus, and that people can wind up in heaven without dying to self and being born again. They generally don't think people need a savior because sin isn't the death sentence the Bible says it is. And you see the same thing happening with the other extreme end, as people are calling them. What were they called? The liberal right wings, where they're doing a lot of the same errors of the far left, but on the far right. And I'm thinking specifically of theological groups that are trying to lift up human nature as if it's not that sinful, and human reason as if it isn't as damaged as it is. Human reason can still be used and has a place, but we have to understand exactly how serious the impact of sin in the fall was. All of these fundamental liberal convictions are offended by the sermon. From the very beginning, Wesley is clear that we can do no good works without Jesus. For there is nothing we are, or have, or do, which can deserve the least thing at God's hand. Wherewithal then shall a sinful man atone for any the least of his sins with his own works? No, were they ever so many or holy, they are not his own but God's. But indeed they are all unholy and sinful themselves, so that every one of them needs a fresh atonement. Only corrupt fruit grows on a corrupt tree, and his heart is altogether corrupt and abominable, being come short of the glory of God. Therefore, having nothing, neither righteousness nor works to plead, his mouth is utterly stopped before God. There is no notion that a person can do works before they know Jesus. All our good deeds are as filthy rags. The only good we can do is that which God does in us. For all our works, all our righteousness, which we were before our believing, merited nothing of God but condemnation. So far are they from deserving faith, which therefore, whenever given, is not of works. Neither is salvation of the works we do when we believe, for it is then God that worketh in us, and therefore that he giveth us a reward for what he himself worketh. only commandeth the riches of his mercy, but leaveth us nothing whereof of glory. For that reason, salvation is inaccessible to anyone who hasn't been born again. The liberal tradition in which I was raised found the born-again language of the evangelicals quite distasteful, as well as any notion of penal substitutionary atonement, the notion that Christ took my place on the cross, so I receive his reward. John Wesley explicitly reinforces the requirement of the new birth. This, then, is the salvation which is through faith, even in the present world, a salvation from sin, and the consequences of sin, both often expressed in the word justification, which, taken in the largest sense, implies a deliverance from guilt and punishment by the atonement of Christ actually applied to the soul of the sinner now believing on him, and a deliverance from the power of sin through Christ formed in his heart. So that he who is thus justified or saved by faith is indeed born again. He is born again of the Spirit unto a new life. The blood language is made explicit when first articulating the faith that saves. This comes after clarifying that there are three kinds of faith that do not save: that of the heathen, that of a devil, and that of the apostles prior to Christ's death and resurrection. None of these prior faiths save because they lack the needed character of saving faith. Christian faith is then not only an assent to the whole gospel of Christ, but also a full reliance on the blood of Christ, a trust in the merits of his life, death, and resurrection, a recumbency upon him as our atonement in our life, as given for us and living in us. And anyone who might want to make a comment on the faith of the apostles prior to Christ's death and resurrection, remember that is the same faith that drove a lot of them to abandon him at the garden and Peter to deny him 3 times. So that is the faith he's talking about. And the gospel authors themselves note there is a shift in how they understand and now see and live things from before Jesus' death and resurrection and after. That's clear in their own writings. So this isn't just being made up here. Next is offending the unscrupulous. There's plenty of that today. I have heard it said by more than one Wesley scholar that the man's favorite book in the Bible was 1 John. It's a wonderful book. The language of that book around perfection is daunting. It is a bedrock for his theology of entire sanctification, which remained a controversial teaching throughout his ministry. He articulates it midway through the sermon, insisting, "He that committeth a sin is of the devil. Whosoever believeth is born of God, and whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God." Once more, we know that whosoever is born of God sinneth not, but he that is begotten of God keepeth himself, and that the wicked one toucheth him not. 1 John 5:18. He that is by faith born of God sinneth not by any habitual sin, for all habitual sin is sin reigning, but sin cannot reign in any that believeth, nor by any willful sin, for his will, while he abideth in the faith, is utterly set against all sin, and abhorreth it as deadly poison, nor by any sinful desire, for he continually desireth the holy and perfect will of God, and any tendency to an unholy desire, he, by the grace of God, stifleth in the birth. To be clear, I'm actually going to read this next section first. Many want to believe that the life of a believer is not so different from that of a non-believer. We cannot escape sin, nor do we need to do so in order to be saved. The blood of Christ has atoned for my sin, so I can relax about righteousness and trust that his atoning sacrifice is enough to cover any additional sins I add to my account. Yet this view is at odds with 1 John and Wesley's rendering of it, as he makes clear those who are saved will not sin. The clear implication is that if you are engaged in any habitual, willful, or desirous sin, you are not saved. You do not have saving faith. You have not been born again. Where does this clarity come from? For a reminder that the name Jesus literally means salvation, and the angel makes clear what it is that he saves us from. Ye are saved, to compromise all in one word, from sin. This is the salvation which is through faith. This is the great salvation foretold by the angel, before God brought his first begotten into the world. Thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. And neither here nor in any other parts of Holy Writ is there any limitation or restriction. All his people, or as it is elsewhere expressed, all that believeth in him, He will save from all their sins, from original and actual, past and present sin, of the flesh and of the spirit. Through faith that is in him, they are saved both from the guilt and from the power of it. These and so many other passages in this sermon are an affront to those who don't want to worry about righteousness, who want to think that they can love Jesus without obeying his commandments, who want to boil that faith down to a set of subjectively interpreted principles rather than a formulated covenant that we need to scrupulously protect and uphold. Now, when Wesley, and this isn't clear in his early writings especially, and he recognizes his harshness on a lot of this stuff, he doesn't lighten up on his theology of it here, but he does lighten up on some of his language and clarify points. So you can still sin as a believer. Right? 1 John 2:1 says, if you sin, we still have an advocate with the Father. You do have forgiveness. However, that does not excuse there to be no attempts to fight your sin. You can't just simply let go of trying to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right? And habitual, willful, desire sin, right? You are willing to sin. You're not trying to struggle against it. You're not repentant. You're not trying to turn from it. Even if you do sin on a regular or semi-regular basis, there's a difference between like habitual, right? Doing that because you want to, and doing it because you stumble into it. A habit is something you form and then willingly keep doing. You can break your habits. So I don't want to try and water that down too much. 1 John is convicting for a very good reason. However, don't then just let that cast you into despair if you are actually trying to work out your salvation with fear and trembling here. Next is offending our current cultural moment. Nobody likes to be reminded that they are born in wickedness and unable to do any good thing. It does not feel good to be told that I cannot save myself, that everything I do is wrong and evil, even if it feels and looks good and right. It hurts me to think that my friends and family with the faith of heathens and devils are enemies of God and will not be saved. It terrifies me to think that my continuance in sin evidences that my life is not actually hid in Christ, and that this persistence in sin indicates a rebellion on my part which has no excuse. Wesley reminds us that when we have true faith, we are also saved from the fear, though not from the possibility, of falling away from the grace of God and the coming short of the great and precious promises. So we are so wicked as to require a supernatural death and rebirth made possible only through the person of Christ. His blood being the only thing powerful enough to cleanse us, which then deserves joyful and faithful, unfailing obedience for eternity. Well, how many are living this way? When we look around our sanctuaries on an average Lord's Day, how many of our peers are living this way? As John Wesley describes our situation, how many people feel much commonality with him? If he is right about how faith and salvation works, well, not many who think they are saved actually are. Their indifference to persistent sin indicates a reprobate spirit, and there is the emphasis there. Their indifference to persistent sin. Their patience about so many with the faith of heathens, devils, and even those followers before Jesus died and rose indicates that few actually fear or believe in the condemnation that actually awaits the majority of people. People of other religions or no religion at all will not be saved because they cannot do any good works or anything meriting God's forgiveness, nor do they know the only one who can save. Those who believe Christ is Lord, but who have not been conformed to his image, cannot and will not be saved because true faith is a disposition of the heart. All this activity we have on Sunday mornings is just so much noise and activity that, without conforming to this recumbency upon him as our atonement and our life, comes to nothing. Salvation by faith exposes that the church too often fails to make the main thing the main thing. That quite often our churches are engaged in the project of making folks feel okay about themselves, despite having neglected to die to self. The church, the primary entity responsible for helping people to hate themselves and their sin, is exposed as falling down on the job. Is it all bad news? Of course not. There is a lot of good news in this sermon. But this, it is said, is an uncomfortable doctrine. The devil spoke like himself, that is, without either truth or shame, when he dared to suggest to men that it is such. It is the only comfortable one. It is very full of comfort to all self-destroyed, self-condemned sinners, that whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed, that the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. Here is comfort, high as heaven, stronger than death. The thing is, though, that this can only be received as good news by those who have unconditionally surrendered all they have and are unto the Lord, or as Wesley calls them, self-destroyed, self-condemned sinners. I think of blessed are those who are poor in spirit, who recognize their status. The goodness of God ought to lead them to repentance, and so it will those who are sincere of heart. When they know there is yet forgiveness with him, they will cry aloud that he would blot out their sins also, through faith which is in Jesus. And if they earnestly cry and faint not, if they seek him in all the means he hath appointed, and if they refuse to be comforted till he come, he will come and will not tarry, and he can do much work in a short time. Wesley is infinitely optimistic about the nature and work of God and his capacity to work in us. He is not at all encumbered by the sort of realistic voice that often requires Christianity to be cut off at the knees in order to be taken seriously. And that is one of the things I personally love so much about Methodism. The indifference to sin and reliance on subjectively defined good works are the primary things attacked in the sermon. To my mind, John Wesley pretty effectively dismantled a dominant mentality in the church, which was very dominant even in his time in the Church of England. I think we would do well to listen to his critique. It is worth remembering, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss. 1 Corinthians 3:13 through 15. Many churches are indifferent to sin. Many church leaders refuse to preach the depravity of man, penal substitutionary atonement, entire sanctification. What passes as the gospel in many churches is actually fatally comprised by rank worldliness, teaching people to take comfort in their own works, their own nature, in a Father that is not just indulgent but somewhat indifferent. It is a false gospel that this sermon exposes. There isn't anything to be done in response except to repent, to renew our faith, and to resolve to preach this faith until we have it. So let's do that. In his own closing words here, I intend to keep doing this series for quite a while. If you believe this analysis is beneficial, which I do, which is why I'm reading it for you guys, then make sure to subscribe and share it with a friend or an enemy. And I intend to do that as well. Again, to highlight here at the end, there's a lot here for the entire church to use. But he is writing from a Methodist position. That is the position I am coming from. So yes, these things are very important. The depravity of man, penal substitutionary atonement, entire sanctification. I've been working on a defense of PSA for some time. I believe I have a playlist on the channel for it, and I might make a video on that sometime soon, actually, after reading this. All three of these things are very important for Methodists historically, and unfortunately in Methodism today, you're not always going to find it where you should be finding it. And that is to our shame. But we'll work on that. But I hope you're enjoying this series. This is going to be convicting at times, as it should be, and it's one that will push and challenge. And if you're someone who rejects salvation by faith alone, I encourage you to look at our resources here on this channel. Feel free to engage with me in comments below and have a discussion, as long as you are keeping it calm and civil and respectful. Strong words and harsh words can be good. The way in which you use them is what matters. You don't just insult someone to insult someone. That's not how you need to be approaching things. You need to be remembering things like Galatians 5:22 through 26. Yes, when Paul talked to the Corinthians, he at times used harsh words, but read 1 Corinthians to see how he was using those harsh words. So just remember that. For everyone else, if you're someone seeking into Christianity, we do have a Discord server that's open to Protestants and those inquiring into the faith. Feel free to join us there. The link is in the doobly-doo. You'll just need to fill out a ticket when you get in there. It'll throw you into a chat, hit that create a ticket button, answer the questions, and we'll get you in there. Just be sure to fill out that ticket, and we'll get you in there. For everyone else, thank you for watching. And, well, just everyone in general, thank you for watching. Please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. We do everything here for free, and I have no intention of ever making this monetized, at least currently. So, unless things change in the future, that is how this channel will be operating, is things for free. You can find me as well on Substack in the doobly-doo below. Feel free to go there, subscribe. If you want to join us in laboring in this ministry here at PCL, that is currently the only way set up to do it, is a subscriber on Substack. If you want to do it in some other way, feel free to talk to me. My email should be below. If it's not, it's on my blog, which is in the doobly-doo below. And we, if enough people want to support and in a way that's not Substack, I will figure something out. Until next time, you guys have a wonderful day. God bless.